The day I became the most hated woman in Willowbrook Estates was also the day I discovered I owned something that would make them all bow down to me. Linda Morrison, our HOA president with her perfectly manicured claws and that condescending smile that could curdle milk, had just served me a cease and desist letter demanding I stop using community property for my unsightly fishing activities. What she didn't know was that I had inherited something far more powerful than she could ever imagine, and when I finally showed her exactly what I owned, the color drained from her Botoxed face so fast I thought she might actually faint right there on my dock. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen who thinks she owns your soul along with your monthly dues, drop a comment below about your worst experience. Trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm a 34-year-old software engineer who thought I was buying my dream home when I purchased the little blue cottage at 247 Lakeshore Drive. After my divorce 2 years ago, I needed somewhere peaceful to rebuild my life, and this house seemed perfect. It sat on a quiet cul-de-sac with a small backyard that sloped down to the most beautiful private dock I'd ever seen. The realtor mentioned it was part of a charming HOA community around Willowbrook Lake, but honestly, I was so focused on the water access that I barely paid attention to the fine print. My late grandfather, who had practically raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, had taught me to fish on lakes just like this one. Those summer mornings on the water with Grandpa Chen were some of my happiest memories. The gentle lapping of waves against the boat, the satisfying weight of a fishing rod in my hands, and his patient voice explaining how to read the water and wait for the perfect moment. After he passed 5 years ago, I hadn't touched a fishing rod. But something about having my own dock again made me want to honor his memory. I spent my first few weeks settling in, working my remote job from the sunroom that overlooked the lake, and slowly getting to know my neighbors. Most of them seemed friendly enough. The Johnsons next door brought me a casserole, and elderly Mr. Martinez across the street always waved when he walked his little terrier. But I kept hearing whispers about Linda Morrison, the HOA president who lived in the biggest house on the opposite side of the lake. Apparently, she took her role very seriously. The first time I actually met Linda was on a Saturday morning in early June. I had just bought a new fishing rod and tackle box, and I was sitting on my dock trying to remember Grandpa's lessons about tying the perfect knot. The morning was absolutely gorgeous. One of those perfect days where the lake surface looked like glass and the air smelled like honeysuckle and possibility. I was so focused on my fishing line that I didn't notice the woman marching down my backyard until she cleared her throat loudly behind me. I turned to see a woman in her early 50s with short blonde hair that looked like it cost more than my monthly grocery budget, wearing a crisp white polo shirt and khaki pants that probably came from the kind of store where they fold your clothes for you. Her smile was the kind that didn't reach her eyes. She introduced herself as Linda Morrison, HOA president, and said she wanted to welcome me to the community. But instead of actually welcoming me, she immediately launched into a lecture about community standards and property maintenance. She informed me that fishing from private docks was discouraged because it created an inconsistent aesthetic around the lake. She suggested I use the community dock on the north side if I absolutely had to fish, though she made it sound like fishing was something slightly less respectable than collecting roadkill. I tried to be polite and explained that I had specifically bought this house because of the dock, and that fishing was important to me for personal reasons. Linda's smile became even more strained, and she told me she'd look into the exact regulations regarding waterfront activities. Then she made a comment that should have been my first red flag. She said that some of the long-time residents were concerned about maintaining the character of the neighborhood, and that she hoped I would be considerate of community expectations. After she left, I felt unsettled but tried to brush it off. I figured she was just being overly formal in her role as HOA president. I had no idea I had just met someone who viewed any deviation from her vision of suburban perfection as a personal attack. For the next few weeks, I tried to be the model neighbor. I kept my lawn perfectly manicured, painted my front door the approved shade of navy blue from the HOA color palette, and even joined the community garden committee. But every time Linda saw me on my dock with my fishing rod, her disapproval was palpable. She would find excuses to walk past my backyard, taking pictures with her phone and making notes on a little clipboard she always carried. The harassment escalated gradually. First, it was passive-aggressive comments at HOA meetings about certain residents not following community guidelines. Then came the formal letters, typed on official HOA letterhead and hand-delivered to my door. The first one cited a violation for leaving my fishing equipment visible from the street, even though my tackle box was barely noticeable on my back porch. The fine was $50. I paid it without argument, hoping that would be the end of it. But Linda seemed to interpret my compliance as weakness rather than cooperation. The letters came more frequently. $75 for having my dock lights on past 10 p.m. while I was fishing, $100 for excessive water disturbance when I was apparently casting too enthusiastically, $150 for leaving my small fishing chair on the dock overnight. Each fine came with increasingly ridiculous justifications. Linda claimed my fishing activities were disrupting the natural tranquility that other residents deserved to enjoy. She said my presence on the water early in the morning was disturbing wildlife patterns and creating liability concerns for the community. She even suggested that my fishing was somehow diminishing property values because it made the lake look too recreational rather than elegantly residential. The breaking point came on a beautiful Sunday morning in August. I had woken up early to watch the sunrise over the lake while trying to catch bass near the fallen log about 50 feet from my dock. It was one of those perfect fishing mornings that Grandpa would have loved. The water was calm, the fish were biting, and I had actually managed to catch 2 decent-sized bass that I planned to release after taking a quick photo. I was just reeling in my second fish when I heard the sharp staccato of high heels clicking across my dock. Linda Morrison was marching toward me like a woman on a mission, carrying her clipboard and looking more self-righteous than I had ever seen her. She was dressed like she was heading to a country club board meeting rather than confronting someone at 6:30 in the morning, complete with pearl earrings and lipstick that could probably be seen from space. She didn't even bother with pleasantries this time. Linda informed me that she had received multiple complaints from neighbors about my inappropriate use of community water resources, and that my fishing activities were in direct violation of several HOA covenants. She claimed that the lake itself was considered community property and that individual residents did not have the right to monopolize it for personal recreation. When I tried to explain that I was fishing for my own dock on what I believed was my own waterfront, Linda's mask finally slipped. She told me that just because I had bought one little house didn't mean I could do whatever I wanted in an established community with standards. She said that if I couldn't respect the rules that everyone else followed, maybe I should consider whether Willowbrook Estates was the right fit for someone like me. The way she said, "someone like me," made my blood boil. There was something in her tone that went beyond HOA regulations, something that made me feel like she had decided I didn't belong in her perfect neighborhood from the moment she met me. But I tried to keep my voice calm and asked her to show me exactly which covenant prohibited fishing from private docks. Linda's smile became absolutely venomous. She told me she didn't need to justify community standards to me, and that I had until the end of the week to remove all fishing equipment from my property and discontinue my disruptive activities on the lake. If I didn't comply, she would pursue all available legal remedies, including daily fines and potential legal action to force my compliance. Then she delivered the final insult. Linda looked me straight in the eye and said that this was her lake and her community, and that I was nothing but a problem resident who needed to learn her place. She said that if I thought I could waltz in and ignore the standards that real community members had established, I was going to learn exactly how wrong I was. As she clicked away on her designer heels, leaving me standing on my dock with my fishing rod in my hand and my heart pounding with rage, I realized that Linda Morrison had just made the biggest mistake of her perfectly manicured life. Because what Linda didn't know, what nobody in this community knew, was that my grandfather hadn't just taught me to fish. He had also left me something that was going to change everything. I spent the rest of that Sunday morning sitting on my dock, not fishing, but thinking. Linda's words kept echoing in my head: her lake, real community members, learn your place. I had spent months trying to be the perfect neighbor, following every ridiculous rule, paying every petty fine, and trying to fit into Linda Morrison's vision of suburban paradise. But clearly, nothing I did was ever going to be good enough for her. That evening, I finally did something I should have done months ago. I went to my home office and pulled out the thick folder of documents that had come with my grandfather's inheritance. When Grandpa Chen died, he had left me not just money and family heirlooms, but also a complicated collection of legal documents that I had mostly ignored because I was too grief-stricken to deal with paperwork. Most of it was standard estate stuff, bank accounts, investment portfolios, the deed to his old house in Oregon. But buried in the middle of the stack was a folder labeled Willowbrook Property that I had never opened. My hands were actually shaking as I broke the seal on the manila envelope. Inside were surveyor maps, property deeds, and legal documents dating back to 1962. As I spread the papers across my desk, I started to understand something that made my pulse quicken with excitement and disbelief. My grandfather had apparently owned property in this area long before Willowbrook Estates even existed. And according to these documents, he hadn't just owned a small lot. The original deed showed that Chen Holdings, my grandfather's small real estate investment company, had purchased 47 acres of undeveloped lakefront property in 1962, including the entire eastern shore of what was now called Willowbrook Lake. Over the decades, as the area developed, Grandpa had sold off most of the land to developers, keeping only small parcels that he considered too valuable to let go. But here's where it got interesting. According to a 1987 survey, my grandfather had retained ownership of a narrow but crucial strip of land that ran along the entire eastern waterfront of the lake. It was only about 30 feet wide in most places, but it included the water rights and lake access for that entire stretch of shoreline. When the HOA community was developed in the 1990s, the developer had apparently negotiated easement agreements that allowed the homeowners to build docks and access the water, but they had never actually purchased the underlying land rights. My heart was beating so fast I thought it might explode. According to these documents, I didn't just own a small cottage with water access. Through my inheritance from Grandpa Chen, I owned the actual shoreline and water rights for nearly half of Willowbrook Lake, including the section that Linda Morrison's precious community dock was built on. But I needed to be absolutely sure before I did anything. The next morning, I called the county recorder's office and spoke with a clerk named Janet who had been handling property records for over 20 years. I read her the parcel numbers for my grandfather's deed, and after some digging through their computer system, she confirmed what I had hoped to hear. The property records showed that Chen Holdings still held clear title to the eastern lake frontage, including water and mineral rights. The HOA had easement agreements that allowed their members to use the water access, but those agreements were specifically tied to maintaining the property in accordance with the original recreational and conservation intent. More importantly, the easements included a clause that allowed the property owner to modify or revoke access if the area was being used in a manner inconsistent with peaceful enjoyment of the waterfront. Janet explained that this kind of situation wasn't uncommon in areas where old family properties had been subdivided for development. Sometimes the original landowners kept strategic parcels or rights that didn't show up in standard title searches. She suggested I contact a real estate attorney to review the exact terms of the easement agreements and understand my full legal options. That afternoon, I called Rebecca Walsh, a real estate attorney whose office was about 30 minutes from Willowbrook Estates. Rebecca had excellent reviews online and specialized in property disputes and HOA conflicts. When I explained my situation, she asked me to bring all my documents to her office the next day for a comprehensive review. Meeting with Rebecca was like having a puzzle master explain a complex riddle that I had been staring at without understanding. She spread my grandfather's documents across her conference table and cross-referenced them with current county records and the HOA's legal filings. After about 2 hours of careful analysis, Rebecca looked up at me with a smile that reminded me of a chess player who had just spotted checkmate in 3 moves. The legal situation was even more favorable than I had hoped. Not only did I own the eastern shoreline and water rights, but the easement agreements that allowed the HOA members to use the lake access included several provisions that Linda Morrison and her community had been violating for years. The original conservation intent clause meant that the water access was supposed to be used for quiet recreational activities consistent with preserving the natural character of the lake environment. Rebecca showed me photographs and documentation from county environmental reports that proved the HOA had been allowing activities that directly contradicted their easement terms. They had installed oversized docks that extended beyond the permitted dimensions, allowed motorboat use that exceeded noise and wake restrictions, and permitted private events on the community dock that violated the quiet recreation requirements. Most importantly, the harassment and discriminatory enforcement I had experienced from Linda Morrison could be considered a violation of the peaceful enjoyment clause that protected my rights as the underlying property owner. Rebecca explained that I had several legal options, ranging from filing formal complaints to potentially revoking the entire easement agreement and reclaiming exclusive control of the lake access. But Rebecca suggested a more strategic approach. Rather than immediately going nuclear with legal action, she recommended that I first document Linda's continued harassment and then confront the HOA with my ownership rights in a formal legal context. If they responded reasonably, we could work out a modified agreement that protected my rights while allowing continued community access. But if they continued their aggressive behavior, I would have clear legal grounds to take more dramatic action. That evening, I sat on my dock with a glass of wine and my grandfather's fishing rod, looking out over the lake that I now knew belonged to me. I thought about all the times Linda Morrison had made me feel small and unwelcome, all the ridiculous fines and condescending lectures, all the mornings when I had felt like I was stealing moments of peace in my own backyard. I had tried so hard to fit into Linda's vision of the perfect community member. I had paid every fine, followed every rule, and swallowed every insult with a smile. But Linda Morrison had pushed too far when she told me this was her lake, and that I needed to learn my place. Now it was time for Linda to learn that she had picked a fight with the wrong person. The next morning, I put my plan into action. First, I installed a small security camera on my dock, positioned to capture anyone who approached my waterfront property. Rebecca had advised me to document any future harassment attempts, and I wanted to be prepared. Then I went fishing, making sure to spend extra time on the water and leave my equipment visible on the dock afterward. I didn't have to wait long. Linda must have been watching my house, because within 2 hours of me setting up my fishing chair, she came marching across my backyard with her clipboard and her righteous fury. This time, she brought backup, a thin, nervous-looking man in an expensive suit who she introduced as the HOA's attorney, David Palmer. Linda launched into her usual lecture about community standards and inappropriate use of common areas, but this time she was more aggressive. She informed me that I had ignored her previous warnings and that the HOA was now prepared to take legal action to stop my violations. Palmer, looking uncomfortable but dutiful, handed me an official cease and desist letter demanding that I immediately stop all fishing activities and remove my equipment from the waterfront area. The letter threatened daily fines of $500 for continued violations, potential legal action to force compliance, and even suggested that my pattern of disrespectful behavior might warrant consideration for forced removal from the community. Linda stood behind Palmer with her arms crossed and that smug smile that I had grown to hate, clearly expecting me to fold under the pressure of legal threats. Instead, I pulled out my phone and showed them the recording app that had been documenting our entire conversation. Then I asked them to wait a moment while I retrieved some documents from my house that I thought they might find interesting. Linda's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly and told Palmer that I was probably just trying to delay tactics. When I returned with Rebecca Walsh's legal folder, both Linda and Palmer looked confused. I opened the folder on my patio table and spread out the surveyor maps and property deeds while explaining that I had recently discovered some interesting information about the ownership of the land they had just threatened to bar me from using. The color drained from Linda's face as I showed them the 1962 deed that established my grandfather's ownership of the eastern shoreline. Palmer leaned forward to examine the documents more closely, and I watched his expression change from skeptical to concerned to absolutely alarmed as he began to understand the implications. I explained that according to my research, Chen Holdings, which I had inherited from my grandfather, owned not just the waterfront where we were standing, but also the lake bottom and water rights for the entire eastern section of Willowbrook Lake. The HOA's community dock, several private docks, and all of the water access that their members had been using for decades was actually on my property, used under easement agreements that included specific terms about peaceful recreational use. Palmer asked to see the easement documents, and I handed him copies of the agreements that Rebecca had prepared. As he read through the legal language, his face became increasingly pale. Linda kept trying to interrupt and dismiss what I was saying, but Palmer held up his hand to silence her while he continued reading. Finally, Palmer looked up from the documents and asked if my attorney had verified the validity of these property claims. I handed him Rebecca Walsh's business card and explained that she had confirmed the ownership records with the county and was prepared to defend my property rights through any legal means necessary. The moment when Linda Morrison finally understood that she had been threatening someone who actually owned the lake she claimed as hers was absolutely priceless. Palmer whispered something to her that made her eyes go wide, and she looked at the documents in his hands like they were covered in poison. Her perfectly composed mask cracked, and for the first time since I had met her, Linda Morrison looked genuinely scared. Palmer asked if he could take copies of the documents to review with his firm, and I agreed, but I also made it clear that any further harassment or attempts to interfere with my use of my own property would result in immediate legal action. I mentioned that I had documented Linda's previous threats and discriminatory behavior, and that my attorney was prepared to file complaints with both the county and the State Bar Association if necessary. As they walked away from my property, I could see Linda gesturing frantically and Palmer shaking his head. Their hushed argument continued all the way across my backyard and up the street toward Linda's house. I sat back down on my dock, cast my line into the water, and smiled for the first time in months. But Linda Morrison wasn't the type of person to accept defeat gracefully. Over the next few days, I heard through neighborhood gossip that she was telling people I was trying to scam the community with fake documents, and that she was going to expose my fraudulent claims. She apparently called an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss the legal threat I posed to the community. Rebecca advised me to let Linda dig her own hole deeper while we prepared our formal legal response. She filed paperwork with the county to ensure my property rights were clearly documented in all public records, and she prepared a comprehensive legal brief outlining the HOA's violations of their easement terms. The showdown came at the monthly HOA meeting the following Tuesday evening. Linda had clearly rallied her supporters and packed the meeting with residents who saw me as a threat to their community's stability. She had prepared a presentation about protecting our property values and standing up to legal bullying that was designed to paint me as the villain in this situation. I arrived at the community center with Rebecca Walsh and a box of legal documents, surveyor maps, and historical records that we had compiled over the past week. Linda's confidence was visible from across the room. She clearly expected to use social pressure and community solidarity to force me into backing down from my legal claims. Linda opened the meeting by describing me as a problem resident who was trying to extort the community with questionable legal claims about property ownership. She told the assembled neighbors that I was threatening to steal their lake access and that they needed to stand together against my bullying tactics. When it was my turn to speak, I thanked everyone for coming and explained that I didn't want to take away anyone's access to the lake. I simply wanted to be treated with the same respect that Linda Morrison demanded for herself and other long-time residents. Then I asked Rebecca to present the legal facts about the property ownership situation. Rebecca's presentation was methodical and devastating. She used a projector to show the historical property maps, explained the chain of ownership from my grandfather's original purchase through my inheritance, and outlined the specific terms of the easement agreements that governed the HOA's use of the waterfront. Most importantly, she documented the multiple ways that Linda Morrison and the HOA board had violated their easement terms through discriminatory enforcement, harassment of the property owner, and allowing activities that exceeded the quiet recreation standards required by their legal agreement. The room was absolutely silent as Rebecca explained that under the current legal situation, I would be within my rights to revoke the easement entirely and reclaim exclusive control of the eastern lake frontage. She noted that this would affect not just the community dock, but also the private docks and water access for about 15 homes in the community. But then Rebecca offered the solution we had prepared. Instead of pursuing legal action to revoke the easement, I was willing to negotiate a new agreement that would protect everyone's interests while ensuring that all residents, including me, could enjoy the lake without harassment or discriminatory treatment. The proposed new agreement would include clear guidelines for lake use that applied equally to all residents, establish a formal process for addressing legitimate violations, and include protections against discriminatory enforcement and harassment of any community member. Linda Morrison's face throughout Rebecca's presentation was a study in barely contained rage and growing panic. She kept trying to interrupt with objections and challenges, but Palmer, who was representing the HOA's legal interests, kept motioning for her to stay quiet. It was clear that he understood the legal implications of the situation far better than Linda did. When Rebecca finished her presentation, the room erupted in nervous conversation. Most of the residents seemed shocked to learn about the underlying property ownership situation, and many of them started asking Linda why she hadn't known about these legal complications before she started her campaign against me. One of my neighbors, Mrs. Chen, no relation despite the name, stood up and said that she had always thought Linda's harassment of me was inappropriate and that she was grateful someone was finally standing up to the HOA's petty tyranny. Several other residents nodded in agreement, and it became clear that Linda's support was not as solid as she had assumed. Palmer asked for a recess to consult with Linda and the other board members about their response to our proposal. During the break, several neighbors came up to me to apologize for not speaking up sooner about Linda's behavior and to express their support for finding a fair solution that would protect everyone's interests. When the meeting reconvened, Palmer announced that the HOA board would need time to review our proposal with their legal team, but that they were willing to negotiate in good faith to reach an agreement that would resolve the current conflict. Linda looked like she had been forced to swallow broken glass, but she remained silent while Palmer spoke for the board. Rebecca responded that we were happy to work with the HOA's attorneys to draft a new agreement, but that any further harassment or discriminatory treatment of me would result in immediate legal action to protect my property rights. She also noted that we would be monitoring the situation closely to ensure that the HOA honored both the spirit and the letter of any agreement we reached. As the meeting ended, Linda Morrison avoided eye contact with me entirely. Her supporters seemed confused and uncertain, while the neighbors who had always been friendly toward me went out of their way to shake my hand and express their support. Palmer approached Rebecca to exchange contact information and set up a timeline for legal negotiations. Walking back to my house that evening, I felt a sense of satisfaction that I hadn't experienced since this whole conflict began. Linda Morrison had spent months trying to make me feel small, unwelcome, and powerless in my own community. She had used her position as HOA president to bully and harass me, assuming that I would eventually give up and either conform to her demands or move away. But Linda had made a critical error in her strategy. She had been so focused on asserting her authority over her lake and her community that she never bothered to understand who she was really dealing with. She saw me as just another resident to be controlled and intimidated, never imagining that I might have resources and legal rights that could challenge her power. The negotiations with the HOA's legal team took about 6 weeks, but the final agreement was everything Rebecca and I had hoped for. The new lake access agreement established clear, fair guidelines for all water-related activities and created an appeals process for addressing violations that included oversight from an independent mediator. Most importantly, the agreement included specific language prohibiting discriminatory enforcement and harassment of any resident, with penalties that could include removal from the HOA board for violations. Linda Morrison would no longer be able to use her position to target residents she personally disliked. In exchange for agreeing to the new terms, I granted a permanent easement that secured lake access for all current and future residents of Willowbrook Estates. Everyone got to keep their docks, their water access, and their community amenities, but now those privileges came with legally enforceable protections against abuse. The final twist came about 2 months later. Apparently, several residents had started paying attention to Linda Morrison's behavior in other areas of HOA management, and they didn't like what they discovered. Her pattern of petty harassment and discriminatory enforcement extended far beyond her conflict with me, and other residents started coming forward with their own stories of bullying and unfair treatment. At the next HOA election, Linda Morrison lost her position as president by the largest margin in the community's history. The residents elected Mrs. Johnson, my casserole-bringing neighbor, who ran on a platform of fair enforcement and respectful community management. Linda remained on the board as a regular member, but her days of wielding unchecked power over her neighbors were over. These days, I spend my mornings fishing for my dock without looking over my shoulder for clipboard-carrying HOA presidents. My tackle box sits on my porch where it belongs, my fishing chair stays on my dock overnight, and my dock lights stay on as long as I want to fish. The lake is peaceful again, just the way Grandpa Chen would have wanted it. Linda Morrison still lives across the lake in her big house, but she avoids the waterfront when I'm fishing. Sometimes I see her watching from her upstairs window, probably still bitter about losing the power she thought was hers by right. But the truth is, I don't think about Linda Morrison very much anymore. I won the only victory that mattered, the right to enjoy my own property in peace. The morning sun reflecting off Willowbrook Lake reminds me every day that sometimes the quiet ones really are the most dangerous. Linda Morrison thought she could bully me into submission because I seemed like an easy target. She never imagined that the shy software engineer with the fishing rod might also be the person who owned the very lake she claimed as her domain. Looking back, I think the most satisfying part wasn't just winning the legal battle or seeing Linda lose her position of power. It was the moment when I realized that I didn't have to accept anyone's definition of where I belonged or what I deserved. My grandfather had taught me more than just how to fish. He had taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be intimidated. So here's my question for all of you watching this. Have you ever dealt with someone who used their small amount of power to make your life miserable? Someone who thought they could push you around because you seemed like you wouldn't fight back? Drop a comment and let me know how you handled it, or if you're still dealing with your own Linda Morrison, maybe this story will give you some ideas about fighting back. And if you enjoyed this story of HOA karma coming full circle, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of neighborhood justice. Trust me, I've got plenty more stories about people who thought they could abuse their power, only to discover they had picked the wrong target. You won't want to miss what happens when the quiet ones finally decide to show their teeth.